What lies beneath? There is no corner of the Imperium so low, no slum so wretched, that the Emperor's gaze does not reach, or so I had always believed. That was until I laid eyes on Slump Hollow, its shanties sagging under the weight of algae-stained air, and the twisted unfortunates that toiled in its endless pits of green sludge.
"You shouldn't have come here, stranger,"
a voice rasped as I stepped from the transport and into the harsh light of Tredora's yellow sun.
"Strangers ain't welcome, and folk that ain't welcome tend to turn up missing."
The speaker stood knee-deep in an algae pool off to the side of the road. He was short and fat, his skin tanned to leather, and an irrational anger burned in his squinting eyes. His shaved head glistened with sweat, which he wiped away with one hand before smearing it on his already soiled tunic. My work with the administratum rarely made me popular, so I was no stranger to hostility such as this. I offered him my best disarming smile. He did not return one. "Well, which is it?" I asked.
"What?"
He grunted. "Are they missing, or do they turn up? They can't be both now, can they?"
"What?"
He snapped again, his confusion only deepening. I sighed. "I'm looking for Overseer Towelin. Which way?" The man said nothing. Instead, he raised an arm and jabbed toward one of the larger dilapidated buildings further down the road in the center of town, his stubby finger twitching, as though eager to point me away from him and toward trouble. "Thank you kindly," I said. He said nothing and simply scowled back. It wasn't far, so I locked the personal transport and decided to walk the rest of the way. If I'd had any inkling of what was to come, I wouldn't have taken a step. I would have leapt back in that transport so fast and fled for my life. But at that moment, I was blissfully ignorant of the danger I was so casually strolling towards. The roads through Slump Hollow were more mud paths, uneven and pockmarked. The sun had scorched the surface hard so that it cracked with a crunch as I walked. The air was thick with the stench of algae, rot, and something metallic I couldn't quite place. The first structures I passed, and calling them structures at all is being generous, were little more than one-story shanties that leaned drunkenly against one another either side of the road. Their crumbling walls had been repeatedly patched over the decades with sheet metal, plastic, and the like, so much so that their walls were more a mismatched quilt of scavenged scraps than anything that approximated brick or rockcrete. As I passed them, curtains twitched, shutters slammed, and gaunt faces with sunken eyes retreated to watch me suspiciously from the dark interiors of their dwellings. I passed a woman with a sharp, bird-like profile and wearing dirty blue overalls. She watched me with a mix of confusion and disdain as I approached, her cracked lips mouthing something inaudible. I raised a hand and was about to wish her the Emperor's greetings when she hissed at me like a feral cat, and then dashed away into a nearby shanty. With a loud bang, she slammed the door closed behind her with such force that some of the pieces of trash and repurposed wood of the front wall actually fell off to clatter to the ground. Again, my work of delivering less than welcome news on behalf of the administratum meant people were often not too pleased to see me, and considering how remote Slump Hollow was, their somewhat backward and apprehensive attitude to my arrival was to be expected. So I didn't take it personally. I lowered my hand and continued on my way. The streets were pretty much deserted. I didn't know much about agriculture, and what with the harsh sun, I just assumed it was normal, and that everyone was likely at work in the algae pits. Slowly, the shacks gave way to more substantial rockcrete buildings with multiple stories. They too had clearly seen better days and were also in desperate need of maintenance. In the doorway of one such building stood a man, skeletal, thin and hollow-cheeked, his gaze darting nervously between me and the road from where I had come. "Emperor's blessings on this fine day," I said with a smile and a wave. He recoiled at my words, his eyes bulging in alarm,
Don't stay.
He blurted out before stepping backwards, to be swallowed by the thick, shadowy darkness beyond the doorway. "Excuse me?" I asked, and was about to follow after him when something hard struck my foot. I looked down to see a ball, dull brown and scuffed from use. I bent over and picked it up. It was small enough to fit snugly in my palm, its surface cracked and weathered with a single grey patch that was frayed and uneven. A little girl appeared at the mouth of an alley on the other side of the street. She was dressed in filthy rags that hung off her scrawny frame. Her hair was a matted tangle, and she regarded me quizzically. "This yours?" I asked, as I crouched and held the ball out to her. She hesitated, glancing back over her shoulder. "Don't worry, I don't bite," I added. Reluctantly, she took several steps towards me and into the harsh sunlight. Then she seemed to size me up for a moment before, with a burst of speed, she snatched the ball from my open hand and held it tightly to her chest. "What's your name?" I asked gently.
Senna.
She answered.
You're not from here.
"Is it that obvious?" She pointed to my clothes.
Too clean.
She said, causing me to chuckle. "Well, aren't you a clever little thing?" I replied. Suddenly, a pale woman with frizzy hair and a deep-lined face burst from the shadows of the alleyway behind her. She seized the child by the shoulder and yanked her back.
Come away!
The woman spat, glaring at me angrily.
Don't talk to him!
I opened my mouth to explain myself, but she had already dragged the child into the dark alleyway. The ball slipped from the girl's grasp and bounced once before rolling to a stop just in front of me. Then they were gone. I reached down and picked up the ball and brushed off some of the dust and dirt. Then, totally on impulse, I slipped it into my pocket, resolving to return it to her if I saw her again. I continued on until I found the Administratum building. It was a monolith of crumbling rockcrete, standing significantly taller than the surrounding buildings, but no less decrepit. Its architecture hinted at a time when it might have served as a proud outpost of imperial governance. But that had been long ago. Carvings of the emperor adorned its cracked facade, but they had been eroded into indistinct lumps of stone that barely resembled humanoid shapes. Algae blooms stained its walls in patches of different sickly shades of green, and the once grand stone stairs that led up to its main entrance had been chipped and worn by centuries of use, so that they appeared to sag. Above the doorway, a fractured aquila still spread its wings, though it appeared to have been clumsily repaired and rebolted on at a slight angle, resulting in a lopsided symbol of authority. Of everything I had seen up to this point, that bothered me the most. I made a mental note of it. Though my superiors would view it as a sign of unforgivable neglect, that wasn't why I was here. I made my way up the stairs and pushed open the heavy door, its hinges groaning in protest. I stepped inside and into some kind of reception room. There were no windows. Instead, the room was lit by a single flickering lumen. The air was cool, but it smelt of mildew, and somewhere off in the distance I could hear the dripping of water, each plink echoing like the irregular ticking of a broken clock. There were no furnishings, not so much as a chair or a desk, and most importantly, no one there to greet me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing faintly in the empty space. For a moment, there was no response. Then, from a side door, a figure emerged. She was hunched and twisted, her clubbed foot dragging across the floor as she moved. Her face was a map of wrinkles, her milky eyes barely meeting mine, as her head bobbed in my general direction.
"What do you want?"
She croaked. "I have an appointment with Overseer Towelin," I said, forcing a professional tone. "On official Administratum business." The old woman cackled, a sound like dry paper tearing.
"Then you're late. Towelon's been dead over 20 years now."
"Then who's in charge?" I asked, surprised by the news.
"Overseer Allen. Not that he'll be happy to see you."
"Regardless, I need to speak with him," I said, trying to keep the frustration from my voice. "It's important." She thought for a moment.
He'll be out at the North Pits. Follow me.
She hobbled past and led me back outside and into the unrelenting sun. The old woman shuffled ahead of me, her uneven gait leaving a long dragging mark in the dust of the dirt road. I let her lead the way, but her pace was slow, aggravatingly slow. But I didn't want to upset the locals any more than I had, so I tried my best to stay calm. We passed more rock-creep buildings in need of repair, and then more shacks similar to the ones I had seen before.
Almost there.
She croaked, her voice brittle like dried leaves. Her words hung heavy, not with reassurance, but with the inevitability of what lay ahead. Then the algae pits came into view. They stretched out like vast, festering wounds in the earth, their green surfaces glistening under Tredora's unforgiving sun. I saw a dozen workers wearing stilts as they waded across the larger of the pits, the waterline still coming up to their waists near the middle. Their clothes and very skin was stained a dark green as patches of algae clung to their bodies. Their hollow gazes and blank expressions suggested they had long stopped noticing or caring about the filth that covered them. In their hands, they each wielded long hooked poles that they used to dredge the bottom of the pit. Near the edge of the largest pit stood a man that seemed to be directing them by waving his hands around as he barked orders at them in a harsh voice that carried authority and the expectation of mindless obedience. He was powerfully built with broad shoulders and a barrel chest. His head was shaven and his bald scalp was crisscrossed with scars that told of violence endured and survived. A single long scar ran diagonally across his face, slicing through his rough features like a lightning bolt.
That's Alan,
the old woman murmured, her tone a mix of reverence and apprehension. Her hunched form visibly shrinking further as she said his name, as though speaking it aloud might summon his wrath. As we approached, two workers thrust their poles into the murky sludge and hoisted up a tangled, algae-choked mass from the pit. With a wet, sickening slap, they flopped it onto the bank at Overseer Alan's feet, where it unraveled like a grotesque offering. What I saw was barely recognizable as human. The corpse's bloated flesh sagged in grotesque folds, mottled with sickly greens and purples, where the skin had been torn away in jagged chunks. Its jaw hung open, unhinged and gaping, revealing gums blackened like rotting wood, and a swollen tongue, 3 times its original size, and that dangled limply over cracked teeth. But it was the eyes, or the absence of them, that froze me in my tracks. Where its eyes should have been were hollow sockets, where algae pooled to drip and run down the ruined face like olive-colored tears. Then the stench hit me, powerful enough that I actually took a step back and clamped a hand over my nose. It was a vile concoction of decay and stagnant water that burned my nostrils and clawed its way down my throat. I fought down the urge to retch.
Ha!
Alan exclaimed as he slapped his knee with a loud thwack.
Knew something was clogging the pumps. I knew it.
Then, with cold detachment, he began to poke and nudge at the cadaver with the toe of his boot.
Wonder who it is this time.
He added as the pit workers started chatting amongst themselves. I forced myself to walk up and stand beside Alan, trying to hide as best I could how much the body unsettled me. "Greetings, Overseer. I began when Alan rudely cut me off.
Who's this then? And why did you bring them to bother me?
He asked the old woman that stood behind me, ignoring my introduction and my very presence. Before she could answer, I took out the golden seal I had been given and held it up for his inspection. It was engraved with the sigil of the administratum, the sun's light reflected off of its polished surface to give it a dazzling shine. "I am Adjutant Conrad Thal, here on official administratum business, Overseer," I said, injecting a tone of authority into my voice. Alan's eyes opened wide as he saw the seal, and for a brief moment, I thought I might at last be shown some respect. I was wrong.
You damn fool! Put that thing away!
He grimaced.
Do you have a death wish or something? Flaunting such wealth like that around. People have been murdered for much less. Do you want to end up face down in the pits? That's all I need, another moron blocking my pumps.
Sheepishly, I returned the seal to my pocket. It was then that I noticed that the rhythmic splashes of laborers wading through the sludge and the low murmur of their conversations had come to an abrupt end. Slowly, I turned to see a dozen sets of eyes fixed on me, hungry, desperate eyes. My throat went dry and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. No, they weren't looking at me. Instead, their stares bore into the pocket I had put the seal.
What's this? Some kind of break! Get back to work, you filthy lot!
Alan shouted out.
You've got pits to clear and no time for daydreaming!
Reluctantly, they returned to their tasks. Alan leaned in close.
You'd better come with me. And I'd suggest you keep that thing hidden if you plan to leave Slump Hollow alive.
As you say, Overseer, I replied, forcing a smile. Alan grunted and gestured for me to follow.
Come on then, let's get out of this damned heat.
He said and led me back to the large administratum building. But on our way, we took a much faster, more direct route. Apparently, the old woman had taken us the long way around to the northern pits for some inexplicable reason. We walked past a large temple, the first structure I had seen since I came to Slump Hollow that was immaculately maintained. Its white stone walls were clean and pristine, untouched by the filth and algae stains that pervaded the rest of the town. Two large open double doors dominated its front facing, from which wafted the unmistakable fragrance of incense, so rich I could smell it even at this distance. In front of them was an exaggerated and overly stylized image of the Emperor, symbolizing how he held all the different parts and agencies of the Imperium in his many hands. Thinking that we may have gotten off on the wrong foot and trying to carry some favor with the Overseer, I decided to try my charms and praise the town for it. The people of Slump Hollow seem very devout, under your direction, Overseer, I said as I pointed over at the church. Quickly, Alan reached out and lowered my arm.
It's considered rude to point. The residents are very particular about how they practice their devotions. Best not to get involved, especially as an outsider.
He cautioned, his voice dropping to a near whisper. We reached the administratum building, and I was thankful once again for its cool interior. Alan showed me to his office, a rectangular room with clay-colored walls and with a single lumen globe overhead that flickered weakly and bathed the room in an orange glow. A sturdy desk dominated the center of the room, its surface scratched and worn, with two matching wooden chairs facing each other across the desk. Alan gestured for me to sit and took his own seat. Moments later, the old woman shuffled in, placing two metal cups of cloudy water on the desk before retreating without a word. Alan raised his cup and drained its contents in one gulp. I tried the same, but the liquid had a foul, bitter taste that caused me to choke halfway through. I put down the cup, wiped the water from my mouth and got down to work. I relayed the message and instructions I had been ordered to. As expected, Overseer Alan was not pleased.
We already give more than we can spare.
He cursed, his voice a low growl.
Look around you. This place is falling apart. What do you expect me to do?
I understand your frustration, I replied, my tone measured. But the Great Rift has twisted the very heavens. It is the duty of every loyal son and daughter of the Imperium to chip in that little bit more.
Little bit more. Is that what you call this?
I won't mince words, Overseer. It's bad. We need extra provisions, and the tithe will be expanded to include extra manpower for the PDF. But though things seem bleak, we can prevail in these dark times if we stick together and...
Don't give me slogans. We know all about bleak here. How do you honestly expect me to materialize all this? I don't have the manpower to spare.
He interrupted and kicked his desk hard in frustration. "Forgive me, but it's not my place to say, and I would never think of telling you your own business."
Ha! It's easy to make demands, but it's another thing to have to make good on them.
Alan spat. I raised my hands placatingly. "I am sorry, Overseer. Genuinely I am. But I am just the messenger. In 15 weeks they will come for the tithe. If it does not meet the new quota..." I trailed off and allowed my words to hang heavy in the air. It wasn't a threat. The dire consequences for Slump Hollow, and him personally, if the tithe wasn't fulfilled, were known to us both. We talked more and I allowed him to air his grievances. But there was nothing I could practically do to help his situation. I was just the deliverer of bad news. That was my function. But after a couple of hours, he eventually relented and nodded his understanding.
Is there anything else?
He asked in a bitter, resigned tone. "That is all," I said and rose to my feet. Overseer Allen led me back outside where the sun was already starting to dip below the horizon. Its faint, dying light bathed the pits in a lurid amber glow. "Thank you for your time, Overseer," I said, and turned to leave, eager to put as much distance as possible between myself and this festering sinkhole of a town. But before I could take a step, a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder.
You're not going anywhere.
Alan growled. I stiffened under his grip, instinctively tensing. "And why is that?" I asked, careful to keep my tone steady and even. "And may I remind you that it is a crime to inhibit a government official in the execution of their duties." Alan released me with a grunt and gestured toward the horizon, where the salt flats stretched out endlessly beyond Slump Hollow, their pale expanse dimming under the encroaching twilight.
I'm guessing you're a hiver that doesn't know how things are in the Badlands, so I'll do you a favor and fill you in.
He paused, turning to meet my gaze with a stern but honest expression.
Traveling the salt flats after dark is a death sentence. If you think getting pulled out of the slump is bad, you should see the things we find from the flats. Though more often than not, we don't find anything but red smears.
I glanced out at the endless expanse, imagining the figure from the pit, its swollen flesh and lifeless eyes, and thought about myself, lying abandoned somewhere out there, forgotten and alone. It was true I didn't know what kind of things stalked the nights in this region, and my imagination filled in the unknown with the worst possible terrors I could imagine, sending a shiver through me. "So what do you suggest?" I asked.
You can stay the night here, and you can go at first light. I can't say it'll be comfortable, but it'll be more pleasant than getting eaten alive out there. I can assure you of that much,"
he said. Reluctantly, I nodded. "Fine, I'll stay."
Smart choice. I'll find you a place to sleep, maybe rustle up some grub.
He turned abruptly and went back into the administratum building, and reappeared a short time later with a canvas parcel.
Follow me,
he said abruptly, and walked on at a brisk pace, with me scurrying behind to keep up. We wove our way through a winding maze of narrow alleys, the grime-encrusted walls pressing in on either side. Eventually, we stopped in front of a dilapidated two-story hab building.
You'll stay here,
he said curtly as he forced the old door open by slamming his shoulder into it. The door protested to his intrusion with a piercing creak that hurt my ears and made my teeth ache. Inside, a dim corridor stretched out before us, lined with half a dozen doors on either side. At the far end, a rickety wooden staircase led up to the second floor, where a few more doors waited obscured in shadow. He pulled an iron key from his pocket, the metal scratched and worn, and unlocked one of the doors before he motioned me inside. A single lumen globe glowed overhead, casting pale light on the cramped room. It had a single window, and the only furnishings were a sagging cot, a battered table, and a wooden chair with a leg missing.
There's no one else in the building,
Alan said, his voice low and serious.
So if we're lucky, no one will even know you're here. And trust me, That's the best outcome for all of us. Don't make any noise, keep to yourself, and don't wander. If you hear something, you didn't hear it. And whatever you do, don't open the door after I'm gone. Got it?
Unease coiled in my stomach and I frowned. And why not? Alan's expression darkened, his scarred features hardening like weathered stone.
Because don't. That's why.
He snapped.
You ask too many questions for someone in your line of work.
I opened my mouth to say something witty, but before I could, he tossed the key into my hands.
Lock the door when I leave. I'll be back tomorrow,
he said, setting the canvas-wrapped parcel on the cot. He paused at the threshold, casting one last glance over his shoulder, giving me a look I couldn't quite decipher. And then, he was gone. Left alone in this unfamiliar place, I did as he said. I locked the door, and then I turned my attention to the parcel he'd left behind. I unfolded the canvas wrapping with cautious fingers, revealing the contents Alan had left for me. Inside was a small stack of brittle starch biscuits that crumbled slightly as I touched them, and beside them was a glass bottle of what looked to be murky water. It was then that my stomach reminded me that I hadn't eaten in some time. I tried one of the flaking biscuits, and it tasted just as dry as it looked. It crumbled into a chalky paste on my tongue, so thick that my jaw ached from the effort of chewing. I uncorked the bottle, thinking to try and wash it down with a swig of water, but the heady smell of strong alcohol assaulted my senses, and I pulled back. It definitely wasn't water. Still, it felt like I had one of the biscuits wedged sideways in my throat, and I needed to wash it down with something. I drank a large mouthful from the bottle. The liquid burned my mouth and throat as it slid down to cause a soothing warmth to pool heavy in my belly. I picked up another one of the starch biscuits and moved to the window, peering out into the dark scene of Slump Hollow at night as I slowly ate. The alleyways and streets of the slum I could see from this vantage point were eerily quiet, save for the occasional groan of settling timber or faint bubble and plop sounds coming from the distant algae pits. I thought about Overseer Alan and turned the iron key he gave me over and over in my hands. Despite me being the bearer of bad news, he'd been more than fair with his treatment of me. But any administratum messenger that wanted a long life learned not to be too trusting. So it would make sense to try and take some precautions of my own. I slid the cot, that was surprisingly heavy, across the room and braced it against the door. The bed groaned under the strain, but I felt better knowing the extra barrier was in place. And that's when I heard them. A strange, throaty chanting wafted through the window on the sluggish breeze of the night. I moved back to the window again and looked down to see a procession of robed figures as they snaked through the narrow street below. They shuffled in eerie unison, holding lit torches that cast flickering shadows against the crooked, ramshackle buildings. In their midst, several men hoisted a platform on their shoulders, atop which sat a crude effigy of the Emperor, but somewhat overly stylized and crooked. On his head were a halo of stars, and he had multiple arms, each holding a relic I believe was supposed to represent the different imperial organizations. A quill and ink for the administratum, a sealed letter for the Adeptus Telepathica, that kind of thing. As I watched them march along, I picked up a starch biscuit and bit into it with an audible crunch. At the sound, one of the robed figures stopped in their tracks. My heart skipped a beat. Slowly, deliberately, they tilted their head upward towards me. The hood of the robe cast their features in shadow, but I could see their eyes in the recessed darkness. Not like a person's eyes, but like some kind of nocturnal predator sizing up their prey. They shone red and yellow in the torchlight. As they locked with mine, I felt a chill run through my whole body, and I leapt back from the window, my heart pounding. For a long moment I stood there, staring at the window as if the stranger might burst through it at any moment. But nothing happened. And as the chanting faded away, I built up the courage to step back to the window and peek outside. The procession of robe-clad worshippers were gone. I breathed a sigh of relief and sunk down onto the bed. I uncorked the bottle again and drank deeply, allowing the strong alcohol to steady my raw nerves. Then I kicked off my shoes and stretched myself out on the cot. My limbs felt heavy, and the effects of the liquor blurred the edges of my senses. What a terrible place, I thought to myself. Tomorrow couldn't come fast enough, and I couldn't wait to get out of Slump Hollow. I found myself tipping the bottle back again and again, its contents slowly dwindling, until the room spun faintly, and I slipped into unconsciousness. But my sleep was far from restful. My dreams were thick with the stench of decay, of algae and brine. I was sinking in the mire of the algae pits as Overseer Allen watched from the bank, shaking his head in stern disapproval. I struggled as I sank, until I was entirely enveloped. I clawed for the surface, but the green tendrils of algae wrapped around my limbs, pulling me down deeper and deeper into oblivion. I abruptly jolted awake, my heart slamming against my ribs. The tortured screech of the building's front door being forced open tore through the suffocating stillness of the night. The remnants of my nightmare scattered like shattered glass, replaced by the cold certainty that something was very wrong. Overseer Allen's words surfaced in my mind. No one else was supposed to be in the building. Was it him coming back? I looked over at the window. It was still night outside. Surely it was too soon, I thought. The groan of heavy footfalls on the rickety wooden stairs that led to my room snapped me into action. I slid off the cot and I moved with deliberate quiet as I slipped on my boots. The footsteps grew louder, each groaning tread reverberating through the skeleton of the old building. Then came the unmistakable scrape of metal on metal sound of a key being slid into a lock. The lock of the door clicked with a resounding thud, and the doorknob rattled violently. I slammed myself against the bed, forcing the door to remain closed.
"Open up,"
came a harsh voice on the other side of the door.
"Don't make this harder than it needs to be."
I continued to press my weight against the cot and the door, as if my life depended on it. In a shower of splinters, an axe head burst through the door. I glimpsed the wicked curve of its blade through the widening tear it cleaved as it struck again and again. My pulse thundered in my ears as I scanned the room for something, anything I could use to defend myself. The door shuddered, and a muscular arm reached through the breach in the door. My eyes darted to the window. No time, no choice. I made a break for the window. I lifted myself up and over the windowsill. The drop to the street below was larger than I would have liked, but it was better than staying. I pushed off, gravity seized me, and I hit the ground hard. My knees buckled and I landed in a heap on the ground. Pain flared in my legs, but I cast such thoughts aside as I forced myself upright and started to run. At the end of the street, I chanced to look behind me, and to my horror, I saw that two large, powerfully built men were giving chase after me. The streets of Slump Hollow were a maze of twisting alleys and crumbling tenements, every turn shrouded in shadow. My boots squelched and slid on filth as I spun and ducked into a narrow passage.
"There's nowhere to hide!"
A voice laced with sadistic glee called as footsteps echoed after me. My chest burned with every gasping breath, but I couldn't stop. I vaulted over a pile of debris, nearly losing my footing as the loose planks shifted beneath me. The alley opened into a wide square where storage containers were stacked in large piles. I ducked behind one such container, pressing myself flat against it and willing myself to become invisible.
"Spread out. He's close,"
growled a voice. I peered over the edge of the crate and saw two figures as they emerged from the alley. One clutched an axe, while the other held a length of chain that dragged noisily against the ground. My breath hitched as their heads swiveled, scanning the shadows looking for me. I moved, keeping low as I slipped between the remnants of some toppled boxes. But just as I reached the edge of the square, a wooden crate shifted with my passing and fell with a crash. Both heads snapped in my direction.
There!
I bolted. The chase resumed, more frantic now. I darted down another alley, this one narrower and littered with refuse. I turned a corner only to be confronted by a rusted metal gate. Without breaking stride, I grabbed its top and hauled myself over, ignoring the scrape of jagged edges against my palms. I landed on the other side and kept running. For a moment I didn't hear their footfalls, and I thought I'd gotten away. Then the blow came. It struck with the force of a thunderclap, sending me sprawling into the muck. Stars exploded in my vision, and I barely registered the hands that grabbed me, flipping me onto my back. A sack was shoved over my head and tied tight, its coarse fabric scratching my skin. I thrashed around, but more hands pinned me, iron strong and unyielding, before they bound my wrists together in front of me with some kind of cord that bit into my flesh. Then they dragged me backwards, my boots scraping uselessly against the ground, and I was powerless to stop them.
"You're a quick one, but not quick enough,"
a voice mocked, thick with triumph. I had no sense of direction, so I couldn't tell where exactly they took me or how far away it was. But I do remember being pulled down several flights of stairs before they threw me onto a cold, hard floor. The impact knocked the wind from my lungs and I lay there stunned. Around me I heard voices, like predators arguing over who would get to devour their prey.
"We must bring him before the prophet,"
said one.
"No,"
snapped another, low and venomous.
"Bringing an outsider here, have you lost all sense? He is unworthy. We should kill him and be done with it."
You speak as if it's your decision to make.
Outsiders are dangerous. Worse, they are weak.
Do you dare speak for the prophet? Do you presume to know his will?
I lay motionless as I listened to the exchange that sent a shiver down my spine. My mind raced, searching for meaning in their words. Did they intend to rob me, or just kill me? Why were they doing this to me? And who was the prophet?
"We all know what must be done,"
came a new voice.
"The prophet transcends us. Put your faith in the many-handed emperor. He will know what to do. The stranger will be embraced or eliminated. All shall be as it has been ordained to be."
Before I could arrive at any answers, hands yanked me upright, and I was roughly pulled forward on the move again. Without warning, the sack was ripped from my head, and I blinked as I was confronted with a sight that struck me dumb with barely comprehensible horror. I found myself in a large cavernous lair that stretched out like the belly of some diseased beast. It looked like it may have once been an old wastewater system, but now rusted metal beams jutted from the cracked and crumbling walls, coated in a thick layer of filth, pockmarked with corrosion and streaked with dripping, brackish fluid. Tendrils of knotted algae hung from the high-domed ceiling, glowing faintly green and casting warped, sickly light across the space. And they were everywhere. The people of this accursed place were dressed in soiled rags, their unwashed bodies assaulting my nostrils with a visceral, rancid stench. They chanted something I couldn't understand in a tone that grated against my ears. In amongst the people were these monstrous things, twisted, hulking figures with bloated muscles and extra limbs. These aberrant mockeries of the human form swayed and chimed in the chorus of chanting, while their human counterparts seemed totally at ease with their unnatural presence. I wanted to scream, but before I could, I was shoved from behind. My captors pushed me through the throng as they parted like water around us, until I arrived at the massive thing the congregation had gathered around. It was a mountainous Xenos form, half hidden in the gloom. It practically radiated evil. My legs became weak, and my knees nearly buckled as I was forced to stand before it. It was grotesque in ways my mind struggled to process. A towering amalgamation of alien flesh and cruel design. Its chitinous body shimmered with an unnatural sheen, its elongated limbs ending in claws that could rend a man in two with just a flick of the wrist. Its bulbous head was crowned with ridges, and its eyes gleamed like polished obsidian, staring at me with a predatory cosmic intelligence. It moved and slowly uncoiled. The air grew heavy, and a fresh wave of terror crashed over me. It wasn't just fear. It was as though my very soul was being dragged to the surface, laid bare before this monstrous otherworldly being. Around me, the cultists fell to their knees, their chants reaching a fevered pitch of ecstasy as they bowed their heads and groveled before this Xenos thing. The patriarch moved, one clawed hand stretching toward me. And for a moment, I felt the pull of its will, an alien whisper brushing the edges of my mind, beckoning me to submit. Something inside me snapped. With a surge of desperation, I bit down on the hand gripping my shoulder and holding me in place. I tasted blood. The man cried out, loosening his hold, and I slammed my elbow into his ribs. He stumbled, and before anyone could look up from their prostrations to react, I ran. I fled into a circular side tunnel lined with scarlet moss. The air was humid, choking, and my feet slipped on the uneven floor more than once. But I kept running. Right behind me, the cultists were in pursuit, their shouts mingling with the guttural, animalistic growls of the aberrant things I had seen. I didn't dare look back. The tunnel branched again and again and again. I had no sense of direction and chose my path at random. I turned down a side tunnel and slipped and fell, the ball in my pocket hurting my leg as I landed on it. I took it out and hurled it down one of the other side passages. It clanged loudly as it ricocheted off the walls, the sound echoing like a gunshot. They mistakenly seemed to think the racket was me, as the guttural shouts of the Xenos worshipping cultists followed after it. Quietly, I got back up and pressed on, deeper into the labyrinth. I passed corpses, their faces twisted in terror, and strange alien growths that pulsed and twitched with puckered orifices that wept a sticky black ooze. Finally, I found myself in a dead-end chamber. Panic set in as the shouts of the cultists once again grew louder. They were closing in. My eyes darted around the room, and then I saw it. There was a rusted vent, high on the wall, partially obscured by dangling algae. I leapt, scrambled up the wall and tore at the growths. My muscles burned as I summoned every ounce of strength I had to tear the grating free before I pulled myself up and into the vent. Just as I disappeared inside, they burst into the now empty dead end below. I held my breath. The sound of their enraged cries echoed up to me as they ran on, searching for me. I crawled and shimmied my way up the narrow, suffocating passage I found myself in, through filth and sludge that made me gag and retch. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. And then, at last, I saw it. There was a faint light ahead. I clambered toward it until I eventually pulled myself out and into the open air of the surface. I collapsed forward and onto one of the mud roads of Slump Hollow, the faint glow of sunrise bleeding into the sky, turning it a fiery orange. My chest heaved, and my body trembled from the exhaustion and the trauma. But I was alive, for now, and I had to get out of here. I staggered down the empty streets of Slump Hollow, the faint crunch of dry dirt under my boots the only sound. I searched the crumbling buildings I passed, their jagged silhouettes etched against the faint light of the rising sun. But nothing looked familiar. Figures began to emerge from the shadows of their hovels. They didn't speak or move towards me. Instead, they stood in doorways or leaned against the warped beams of their makeshift homes and watched me with expressions of confusion and hostility. Like the cultists, they wore filthy clothes with drawn, haggard expressions. For all I knew, they could have also been cultists, or at least in league with them. Panic started to well up within me at the terrible thought, and I broke into a sprint. Then, Emperor be praised, I recognized the road ahead of me. It had been the one I had walked down when I first arrived. Relief surged through me, lending strength to my exhausted limbs. Just beyond a row of shacks, beside a shallow algae pit, was my transport. As far as I was concerned, its dull, pitted and dust-sodden metallic surface had never gleamed so beautifully. I ran straight for it. And then it came. A blur of motion from the shadows, swift and sinuous, faster than any man or animal I'd ever heard of. My first thought was that the very shadows themselves had come alive, to drag me back down to the darkness of the cultist's lair. The Xenos lunged towards me with 4 taloned arms as the mouth of its bulbous head opened impossibly wide. Then, it barreled into me, its weight driving me into the dirt, like I'd been hit by a speeding cargo transport. The impact sent shockwaves through my body, knocking the wind out of me as we tumbled together, a chaotic blur of limbs and claws and guttural snarls. When we came to a stop, I found myself pinned beneath it. I tried to struggle against its overpowering strength, but to no effect. Its bulbous head leaned in close, drool dripping from its gaping maw filled with sharp, pointed teeth. It squeezed me in its grasp, and its talons dug into my shoulders, piercing the flesh and soaking my clothes in blood. I cried out in pain and anguish. I expected that at any moment one of those claws would disembowel me and spill my life across the dirt of this accursed backwards place. I was so close to escaping. So close. In righteous fury, I somehow managed to throw the creature off of me. I felt a sudden piercing sting in my neck as a barbed appendage shot from its mouth to strike me. My vision swam as whatever Xenos toxin it was invaded my blood, but my survival instincts kicked in and I surged to my feet. Despite the disorientation, how everything around me became a jumbled blur and the burning sensation in my veins, I made a break for the transport. The creature let out a screech behind me, but I didn't risk looking back to see if it was giving chase. My trembling hands fumbled with the access panel on the transport's door, the runes on the keypad swimming before my eyes. Somehow, through sheer force of will, I managed to punch in the code of activation, and the door hissed open. I threw myself inside and slammed the lock button, the satisfying clunk of the bolts engaging, providing a fleeting sense of security. But my head swam, my vision doubling and then tripling, the world outside the windshield a kaleidoscope of distorted shapes. A cold sweat drenched my skin, and my hands slipped on the controls, slick with moisture. The warmth in my neck spread, a pulsing heat that radiated outward, sinking deep into my chest and limbs. It wasn't a comforting warmth, but something oily and suffocating, as though my veins were being filled with liquid fire. I didn't know if the creature's venom was lethal, but I knew that I wouldn't be dying here. My hands shook as I gripped the controls, roused the engine's machine spirit, and set the transport into motion. The loud, throaty hum of the engine momentarily blocked out the auditory hallucinations of alien voices I heard whispering to me in my fevered mind. I slammed down hard on the accelerator and sped down the dirt road and off into the salt flats as fast as I could, leaving the nightmare of Slump Hollow behind. But the voices I heard in my mind grew louder, more insistent. My vision darkened, tunneling, the world narrowing to a single point of focus. But I'd done it. I'd gotten away, I told myself. I'd escaped, hadn't I? A voice in my mind that wasn't mine answered, "No."